You wake up 10,000 years ago. Your neighbor caught a fish yesterday that he swears was the size of his own leg, and by the time anyone else got to the riverbank to check, it was already gutted, cooked, and gone. Everyone's heard the story 3 times now, and it grows a little each telling. You caught something bigger last month, and nobody believed you either, because by the time you dragged it back to camp, there was nothing left to point at. You're sick of the biggest moments of your life evaporating the second they're over, with nothing left behind but your word against someone else's. You want a way to freeze a moment and keep it permanently so nobody can argue with it later. Sitting in your hut one afternoon, you notice a thin crack in the wall, throwing a small patch of light onto the opposite side, and inside that patch of light, upside down, is a tiny, perfect moving picture of the world outside. The trees, a bird crossing, your neighbor walking past, flipped head over feet. You block the crack halfway, and the little picture gets dimmer, but sharper. You open it wider, and it gets brighter, but blurs into mush. Light is already drawing pictures for you, for free, on every wall in camp. You just never had a reason to look. Turns out, you're not the first to notice. People have been staring at this exact trick for thousands of years before you get around to it. Philosophers describing the same upside-down image leaking through gaps in tent walls and window shutters, long before anyone writes the word camera. You're not inventing the picture, it's been there the whole time. You just need to catch it. You grind down a lump of clear stone into a curved lens and fit it into the crack, and the little upside-down world snaps into focus, bright and sharp at the same time. No more trading one for the other. Opticians working centuries after you land on the same idea independently drop a ground lens into the hole, and the box gets dramatically better at its one job. Now you've got a small, dark room with a perfect, bright, moving picture of the outside world painted on its wall. The problem is obvious. The second you notice it, the second you look away, it's gone. You haven't caught anything. You've just built a very complicated window. You try tracing it. You sit for hours with a stick of charcoal, copying the little projected image onto the wall by hand while it flickers in front of you. It works, sort of, for centuries. Artists set up exactly this box and trace the image line for line to get their proportions right. But it needs a person standing there the whole time tracing, and it's only ever as good as the hand holding the charcoal. You're so close. The light is doing all the hard work. You just need it to hold still on its own, without you. You start coating things in whatever sticky, dark substance you can find, on the theory that maybe light itself can do the marking instead of your hand. Most of it just melts in the sun, or does nothing at all. Eventually you find a tar-like resin that does something genuinely strange. Wherever light hits it long enough, it hardens. Wherever light doesn't reach, it stays soft. Smear a thin coat onto a metal plate. Seal it inside your lens box. Aim it at the world outside, and wait, and wait. The exposure takes the better part of a day, long enough that the sun visibly moves across the sky while you're waiting. And when you finally wash the soft, unhardened resin away with solvent, the picture that's left behind has shadows falling on 2 different sides of the same building, because the sun wasn't in the same place when the exposure started as when it finished. It's real, and it's permanent. It's also completely impractical for anything that isn't a rooftop willing to hold still for 8 hours, which rules out basically everything you actually wanted a picture of. You need something that reacts to light quickly. You notice a smear of a bright silvery mineral paste darkens wherever sunlight lands on it and stays pale everywhere you've shielded it with a scrap of leather, not from heat, since it does this sitting in the shade of a cool room too, as long as light gets to it. A chemist proves the same point decades before you get there, with a jar of silver salt paste and paper cutouts stenciled onto the side of a bottle. Light darkens it, not warmth, and you can write words in it just by controlling where the light lands. You're into the right chemical. You just need to control it properly. You polish a copper plate, coat it in silver, and expose it to fumes that turn the shiny surface into something genuinely light-sensitive. Load it into your lens box, uncap the lens, and wait. Not 8 hours anymore, but still long, uncomfortably long minutes. Long enough that anyone who moves during the exposure simply doesn't show up in the final picture at all. They're gone, blurred into nothing, while anything that held still the whole time burns and sharp and solid. One of the very first pictures ever taken of a person on a busy street shows an empty road, empty sidewalks, no carriages, no crowds, except for one man standing at a shoe shine stand long enough to actually register, the only human being on the whole boulevard who wasn't moving. Everyone else in that city, that morning, is invisible. Minutes is still too slow to be useful for much besides portraits of extremely patient people. Then comes the leap that actually breaks the problem open. You don't need the picture to fully appear in the box at all. A few seconds of light is enough to leave an invisible trace on the plate, nothing you can see, nothing that looks like anything, and then you can pull that faint invisible trace out afterward, with the right chemicals, amplifying a whisper of exposure into a full, dark, finished image. You Being the genius you are, don't even blink. Somebody a long way from your hut stumbles onto it, almost by accident. Mercury fumes from a broken thermometer, left overnight in a chemical cabinet, quietly develop a barely exposed plate into a complete picture by morning. Exposure time drops from hours to minutes to, eventually, seconds. The box doesn't need the whole event anymore. It just needs a taste of it. There's one problem left, and it's an ugly one. Your plate never actually stops reacting to light. Walk outside with your finished picture, and the parts that are supposed to stay pale keep right on darkening in the sun until your permanent picture quietly turns into a plate of solid black. You rinse it in salt water, and it slows the fogging down, but doesn't stop it. What you actually need is something that dissolves away every trace of the unreacted silver that's left, so there's nothing left in the plate for stray light to react with later. Someone's already worked out which compound does this, a chemist years earlier, with no interest in pictures at all, and once it gets adopted as a fixer, the fogging problem disappears completely. Your image finally stops changing. What you pull out of the developing bath is what stays, forever. You now have every piece, a sharp lens, a light-sensitive plate, a way to pull a fast, faint exposure out into a full picture, and a fix that locks it in place for good. You assemble the whole process, and it works reliably on command. When the method finally gets made public, years later, a government buys the rights outright and hands the whole process to the world for free, and within months, people everywhere are building their own versions of the exact box you just built by hand. One thing still bothers you. Your box is heavy, fragile, and bolted to a stand, because it's built around a slab of coated glass or metal that shatters if you look at it wrong. You want to carry a camera around, not haul furniture. You need a light-sensitive surface that bends without cracking, thin, flexible, and tough enough to survive being rolled into a coil and unrolled again. You cook up a chemical treatment for plant fiber that turns it into a clear, flexible, faintly explosive material, then coat a thin ribbon of it with the same light-sensitive chemistry you already worked out. Roll a length of it into a small handheld box, and for the first time, a camera is something you can carry in one hand and point at whatever's happening in front of you, right now, without setting up a single thing. A company built entirely around this idea sells a small box camera, preloaded with a roll of exactly this material, with one simple pitch: point it, press the button, and let someone else deal with the rest. You can finally do the one thing you actually wanted back when this all started. You catch a moment, permanently, the instant it happens, and nobody can argue with it afterward. Now, watch what everyone actually does with that. The chief hears about the box before you finish fixing your first plate, and by the next morning has declared that an official portrait will be taken for every important decision made from now on. Wars, harvests, marriages, all of it, posed and framed on his terms. The sittings take minutes each. Everyone has to hold painfully rigid, and half the village's important business grinds to a halt while people practice their most dignified, unmoving face. A woman with 3 exceptionally handsome goats decides the entire point of the invention is documenting them. Within a season, she's got a wall of formal goat portraits, goats standing proudly, goats mid-chew looking noble by accident, one goat that simply refuses to hold still and is therefore permanently blurred in every single attempt. She now has opinions about lighting. 2 men who sat for a portrait together spend the following 6 months in open dispute over which one of them blinked first, since the print is slightly too dark to settle it definitively, and neither will accept the other's version of events. The argument outlives the actual event by a wide margin and gets reopened at every gathering either of them attends. A kid nobody paid much attention to before starts turning up everywhere with a small, handheld version of the box, catching people mid-trip, mid-bite, mid-argument, and pinning the results up in the middle of camp for everyone to see. People start flinching whenever he walks past. He's never once caught anyone looking their best, and he's extremely proud of that. The man who used to be best at flint knapping turns out to have the steadiest hands in the village for coating plates and timing exposures, and gets pulled off tool making entirely to run the process full time. The old tool makers are furious. Nobody dares say anything, because he's also the only one who knows how to fix the process when it stops working. Someone requests, in painstaking and elaborate detail, that their portrait be retaken for the 4th time, because the light supposedly made them look older than they are. The person developing the plates starts quietly keeping the first, unflattering version just in case. Then a dispute breaks out over who actually caught the biggest fish this season, and for once, someone has an actual picture to settle it. Except now everyone's noticed the same picture can be posed, staged, and touched up before it's ever developed, and the argument doesn't end, it just gets an extra round about whether the photo itself can be trusted. You finally got your proof. Nobody believes it anyway. Subscribe. And next time, bring a second camera as a witness.